Welcome to the Slavery Museum and Public Engagement panel. This is a combination of a public event and my class on public history. So for my students, I see there is pretty much everyone here. This probably will end before the event will end before the end of our class. So if you wanna, I know that many of you wanna discuss our final papers. So just be sure that we can talk about that. Okay, that parenthesis over. Welcome to the Slavery Museum and Public Engagement panel. This is, this activity is following a series of events. This is not meant to be, this is just for the recording. So if we can, yeah. You can't hear?
No. The microphone will not project to the room.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, louder. They're good? Slavery Museum and Public Engagement panel. This activity is one of our several activities related to the Atlantic slavery and public history, public engagement. Before we start, I have to say that I've been encountering wonderful partners at UCIS, but also at the history department. Pernilla Rogue, who is here, Elena Roberts there, and we have been going into these important discussions in different settings. And at UCIS, this has been a collaboration that has been developing in the way that we actually envision our collaborations to be. So this is an event that follows our visit to the Smithsonian, to the African American Smithsonian Museum past Saturday, and it has been collaboratively planned by the Global Studies Center, the Center for European Studies, the Center for Latin American Studies, the Center for African Studies, and the Center for Ethnic Studies Research. So our goal is that we will discuss the exhibit in a way that even those of you who hadn't been there will be able to follow, and then discuss the ways in which the exhibit is being read or seen by the public, which is ultimately our main goal. So to do that, first I want to say that we are specifically talking about the exhibit entitled In Slavery's Wake, which opened in December at the Smithsonian. We'll be there until June, and then we'll travel to several places in the Atlantic world. And this is a work that I have been involved in the past 10 years maybe. So it's really, really, really good to be able to be here and to discuss the result of this work with you. But to discuss that in a more organized way, I invited Johanna Obenda, who is the main curator of the exhibit. Johanna is a researcher and exhibition development specialist for the Center for the Study of Global Slavery at the museum, the Smithsonian Museum of African American History. She earned a BA in history from the University of Alabama and an MA in public humanities from Brown University. So she will present the exhibit to us and then discuss with our guests Kilolo Luckett, who is a Pittsburgh-based art historian and curator, the founding executive director and chief curator of Alma Lewis, and which is an experimental contemporary art platform for critical thinking, constructive dialogue, and creative expression dedicated specifically to the Black culture. And after Kilolo will be followed by Jason Hank, who is a Spanish teacher at the Beaver area middle and high school, where he has been teaching for a long time, especially Spanish levels 1, 2, 1, 3, 4, and AP classes. So our idea, as you can see, is that we can have the discussions about the museum and then the public in different settings and think about what does it mean to talk about something that is such a big part of everyone's past here, which is slavery, in a way that it can actually be productive. So I'm really, really happy that the three of you accepted the invitation to come, and I am thrilled to see this room full of people engaged in this topic. So thank you, Johanna. Do you want me to pass, or do you prefer to be here? I can pass for you.
Oh, you want to press? Sure, yeah. Sounds great. Okay. All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here with you all. As Keila mentioned, my name is Johanna Obenda. I'm a curatorial specialist at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., and the exhibition developer for In Slavery's Wake, Making Black Freedom in the World. And I hear a group of you have been able to come to the museum to see the exhibition, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. And for those who haven't been able to make it to DC yet, just want to spend some time walking through the exhibition for you to give you a glimpse into some of the stories and some background on the project. Great. So In Slavery's Wake, Making Black Freedom in the World is an international exhibition project that is co-convened by the African American History and Culture Museum, as well as Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, with significant participation from museum professionals, curators, historians, and educators across 4 continents. This group came together, as Keila mentioned, some 10 years ago to start thinking about what it would mean to create an exhibition on the topic of racial slavery that could really cross geographical national borders and boundaries. And so this exhibition, it really centers around a guiding question, which is, how have the histories of racial slavery, colonialism, and Black freedom making shaped the world that we all live in today? For us at the museum in Washington, D.C., this exhibition is, and the project really is a first in many ways. It's our first internationally collaboratively curated exhibition, and our first multilingual exhibition. It's in English and Spanish at the museum. I'll be interested to hear your take on that as a Spanish educator. And as mentioned, it's a traveling exhibition. So this exhibition will move to museums across 4 continents. And each of those venues have, and our partners have chosen languages that best suit their audiences. The exhibition also includes newly commissioned works of art. So art is woven through this history exhibition, and it also includes voices from a newly organized oral history archive, which we could talk about as well. So you can see some of our collaborators here on the screen from this international curatorial team, some of the many collaborators and many hands that it takes to get an exhibition like this moving. And you can also see the tour sort of schedule here too. So as Dr. Grinberg mentioned, this exhibition it has opened in Washington, D.C. It opened in December. and it will be in DC for about 6 months. And later this year, we'll be traveling to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to the Museo Histórico Nacional. And so it's a really exciting time for us at the museum, because on the one hand, we're on the heels of the opening of this project, but we're also preparing for it to move, which is really exciting, from translating the script, making sure all of the loans and the objects are ready to travel, to working with our Brazilian colleagues to see how this exhibition can land and be in conversation with local programs and projects. So another part of this project has been the collection of 150 filmed oral histories of descendant communities and people from across the tour of the exhibition, so in each country that the exhibition will travel to. This set of oral histories will comprise and does a newly opened archive at Brown University called Unfinished Conversations that's open to the public and researchers. And some of these stories, some of these oral histories are in the exhibition itself. So this has been a major part of the project, and we'll hint on that a little bit later. But this is a glimpse into a big picture overview of this big exhibition project. There is this output that is a physical exhibition, but as you can see, there are a lot of sort of moving parts behind the scene, and really we see the traveling exhibition as almost like a catalyst to sparking different local activations as it moves. So in Washington, D.C., we're thinking about public programs and symposiums and teacher workshops. In Brazil, our partners are thinking about sort of similar sets of activations and different sets, and so on in Senegal, South Africa, Liverpool. So it's exciting to think about over the 4 years, the global audiences that will not only come in contact with the physical exhibition, but in contact with other, activations that are connected, or at least in sort of dialogue with the project. Yeah. So I can talk a little bit about the content for the exhibition. One of the central goals of this international curatorial team was to tell an international story around the histories of slavery and colonialism, but to do so through the lens of those who experienced that history. And so we needed to ask ourselves, what can we learn from enslaved people, colonized people, and liberated people themselves, right? And thus it became pretty clear early on in the exhibition development process that we weren't aiming to create an encyclopedic story or an exhaustive telling of this history, but rather an expansive set of stories, almost a kaleidoscopic approach that elevated those lived experiences in the ways that everyday people navigated the histories of slavery and colonialism, and really coming at this from less of a top-down approach and kind of thinking about what can we kind of glean from those of the past. And so that's a sort of orienting space of a lot of the storytelling. Next slide. In the exhibition itself, there's a central section that's dedicated to these personal stories, 9 stories of people from across geographies, across time periods, who are navigating these systems of slavery and colonialism and making freedom for themselves, often under the most oppressive of conditions. And this was a really interesting set of stories to develop, or an interesting sort of interpretive approach for us, because it was quite collaborative. Each of the collaborating curators brought to the table a story from the region that they're from, that they're representing, that could speak to a local history, but a story that could also be expanded out to connect to collective action, right? Stories connected to rebellion, spirituality, artistic expression, political action. And so these personal stories, these vignettes, we see as like human-centered windows for our visitors to peer into this longer, vast, and very global history. And these stories are quite transnational within themselves, right? So we have a story of an African-American abolitionist, William Powell, who's born in the United States, but is also working as an abolitionist in Liverpool, England. Or the story of a woman named Mariam Diarra, who's escaping slavery in what's now Mauritania, fleeing, walking over 200 kilometers with her 3 children into northern Senegal. And so through these individual stories, we start to, see how interconnected our world is in this history, and make those global links. I can give you an example of one of these stories that surrounds the life of a woman named Panza, who is a founding member of the Saramacca Maroons, a group of people who descend from people who fled plantations in Dutch colonial Suriname. Panza is remembered by the Saramacca people today as the ancestor who brought a seeded variety of rice to their community before she fled the plantation to join the Saramacca rebels in the forest. She secured grains of rice in her hair and later planted that rice and sustained the Saramacca people for generations. There's still rice that the Saramacca grow that bear her name. And so through Panza's personal story, we get to reflect on rice and memory and oral history and the roles that African women played as cultivators of community in the Americas. But we can also connect to this broader topic and broader movement of marronage and maroon communities across the Atlantic world. And so in the gallery, Panza's story is situated next to this story on maroon communities, and you can see a little bit of this, a mapping experience where visitors can see some of these many maroon communities formed around the world, and learn a little bit more about 3 of them: community in Veracruz, Mexico, Palmares, Brazil, and then Mauritius off the east coast of Africa. So this is kind of an example for you to see how the personal and the sort of collective kind of interplay. And these personal and collective stories are materialized in the exhibition by objects from the museum's collection, but also really exciting loans from our international partners. And that's been a really exciting part of this project, is to think about how through collaboration, different institutions can leverage their collections to tell different stories or fuller stories. So I like to think of our collections as being like pieces to a puzzle. They stand on their own, but when we bring them together, we're able to talk about a different type of history, or at least kind of peer in through a different perspective, something a little bit more expansive. And so these are some of the objects in the show, and you can see how they touch on, not only do they bridge geographies and time periods, but they also touch on what we call internally and also externally in the exhibition, a universe of freedom-making practices, from religious practices to political action, armed rebellion, artistic creation, and kinship building. The work of artists, contemporary artists, is also woven through this historical experience. As a curatorial team, we had a lot of conversations around this topic, and I felt really strongly about thinking about how this exhibition could do some work to break down some disciplinary boundaries that you might find in a typical museum experience, right? Where this is a archaeology exhibition, this is a history exhibition, this is an art exhibition. And I think that when you break down those divisions between art and history, you're able to, and we were able to provide different access points in to understanding the history for our visitors, but also for them to process the history. So if you go to the next slide, you can see some of the many artists that are featured in the exhibition. Some artists created new works for the exhibition that helped materialize concepts that were really central to the storytelling. For example, on the last slide, you saw a picture of a large installation by an artist named Daniel Minter, who helped us materialize this concept of a universe of freedom making. And other artists created new works that sort of reclaimed lost histories, suppressed histories that have been fractured. And so if we go to the next slide, we can look at one of those artists whose work in the exhibition really does this process of artistic reclamation. We're really lucky to work with an artist named Nugent Smith, who created 8 artistic banners in honor honor and inspired by historic flags carried in anti-slavery movements. So these flags, are noted in the historic record, but no longer exist today materially. But working with the record, working with the curatorial team, Nugent was able to think and kind of reimagine what these banners were like through his own artistic lens. So these are his own imagining and kind of providing a new type of material culture for our visitors to kind of be an entry point into these types of histories, right, of anti-slavery movements. So on the screen at the top, you'll see his flag created, inspired by and in honor of the Bahia conspiracy in Bahia, Brazil. And then below is a flag created, inspired by a flag carried by the Stono rebels, which is the largest slave rebellion in British North America. And then these are GIFs, so in a different time you can see them move, but you'll see Nugent's uncle here at the bottom. His name is Anthony Phillips, and he's a blacksmith. And so this became a really cool intergenerational project between Nugent and his uncle, where Anthony Phillips was able to create a set of 8 flag supports inspired by Nugent's designs. And so that's the type of thing you don't see in the exhibition itself, but it's a sort of behind the scenes stuff that is a big part of this type of work, right? There's a sort of an end output in a product, but really the process and the type of connections that we can make is just as crucial. So another big goal of this exhibition of the curatorial team was to think about how we can help our visitors make connections between the past, between these histories of slavery and colonialism, to our current moment. And so when thinking about creating an exhibition, it's always preferable when we can to show rather than tell, right? So how do we show these connections between the past and the present? One way that we can do that is by bringing artifacts together. And by working in a collaboration, we can bring artifacts from different spaces and geographies in conversation with one another, as well as objects from different time periods, so historic and more contemporary artifacts. So if you look at the next slide, that's an example of one of these object pairings. So here we've brought in conversation a set of slave ID badges from Charleston, South Carolina, with an apartheid-era passbook from Cape Town, South Africa, and this material meditation on surveillance and segregation of Black communities across time and space. And another way we get to these sort of reverberations, as Christina Sharp has termed, right, the wake of this history is through the voices of everyday people like you and me and all of us in this room. And so we're really lucky in the exhibition to be able to feature the voices and stories of some of those oral history participants that I mentioned at the top, speaking about how the legacies of this history impact the communities that they live in today. And so you'll just see a few images of some of the participants here and some of the themes that came out of each of these oral history sites, right? Whether it's stories of environmental justice and injustice in Africatown, Alabama, to histories of historical erasure, but also contemporary practices of reclamation in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to race and resilience in Liverpool, England. And so this is a really important part of the exhibition process because their voices add to that multivocality of the project in general, and kind of do some work to break down this idea of like museum and curator as a sort of authority. And yeah, finally, I think a big thing that we were thinking about in this exhibition is this concept of the future, right? So thinking about the futures of past, how enslaved people envisioned their futures, strive to create freer futures for themselves, how freedom makers and Black communities in the 20th century were building upon the legacies of their ancestors, and adapting certain tools to meet the challenges of their time, and how communities today are continuing that work, meeting the challenges that we are all facing locally and also globally. And so when we think about the creation of futures in the exhibition, we have a section that's more contemporary, and it's based on how different communities today are building the future, whether that's through political movements, protest, fashion, music, restorative justice and reparative justice, and also healing. So I can show you an example of a story that comes out of this topic of healing. What we find is, and what's clear is that for many descendant communities, the project and the practice of healing is one way into building freer, more just futures. And so we approach that bigger thematic in a few ways in the exhibition, but one of the, which I think is a really powerful set of object stories, is around textile art, and how textile artists from around the Atlantic world are tapping into these making traditions to come together and process trauma, past trauma collectively, and also come together and tell their stories more truthfully and fully. And so in the exhibition experience itself, we're able to, as the show travels, rotate several quilts and tapestries. These are just three of them here, and they're amazing, and we're able to be in conversation with some of these artists and collectives. But one that you see on the edge here is coming from a group of weavers in Mampuhan, Colombia. In their work, they reflect on slavery and its legacies in Colombia. In the middle, this quilt was created by a group of inmates at Angola prison in Angola, in Louisiana. It's the largest maximum security prison in the United States. And this particular quilt, the blueprint, tells the story of this quilting collective. And finally, the last quilt on the screen is coming from the UK. It's created by a group of survivors of modern day human trafficking who have come together to sort of process that through making. And finally, I'll end us here. The exhibition physically culminates in a visitor response area where we invite visitors to also share their thoughts and ideas. We ask 3 questions that they can respond to, right? So how does this history impact you? What does freedom mean to you? And what is your vision for a freer future? I think, this exhibition doesn't have a particular call to action, but what we hope is that as people make their way through, they're able to learn about movements for freedom, both historic and in today, and perhaps take some inspiration, particularly from historic freedom makers, and think about how some of the actions and tools that people of the past have used might be applicable in confronting some of the ongoing challenges that we're facing both locally and globally. And so the hope is that when people exit the exhibition and they enter back into the world, they might view this history that we all share as an actionable type of history. And I think it's important for us to see ourselves as a part of that, right? History, and not so separate. And so by trying to connect the past and the present, that's our big goal. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Up. Is that okay if I stand up? Absolutely. I know this is a little tricky because I think it's a real mic, but it's a mic that goes into the recording. Yes, somebody has a question.
I'd like to invite visitors. We have just across the street a cultural center in Latin America. We have the Museum of History for Latin Americans, and right now exhibit of art and crafts from Haiti.
Oh, wonderful.
And then if you can make exchange, if you like them, exchange visits, exhibits, if you can bring some of your artifacts. And then we'll just get the interventions at the end so that we can move on with our panel. Thank you.
Great. All right, I'm going to stand up. Just me too. I just like to make eye contact with everybody. So, hi, Luce Amanda. Before I begin. So, it's an honor to be here in dialogue with you all. It's wonderful to meet you in person finally. Thank you for the invitation, Dr. Keila and Luce Amanda. My name is Kilolo Luckett, and I'm an art historian and curator here in Pittsburgh. And I am originally from Mississippi. Does everybody know where Mississippi is? Okay, some people are, challenged with the map. But yes, I come from the Deep South. I'm a product of the 70s. So my parents lived through racial apartheid, and they never, ever fathomed that their children and their grandchildren would be living through one of the most unbearable times of our lifetime. And so I just want to start off with honoring my ancestors who made me possible for me to be here today. And so I'm just going to take you on a little journey about my art history and curatorial practice and how I call it the Blacksonian. And how that really shapes and forms my practice here. I have an art space, a contemporary art space called Alma Lewis, and you'll get to know it a little bit as I talk through this presentation. So, next slide, please. So everybody probably received this flyer, right? You're familiar with it. And I was really struck by the actual kind of topic, the title of this, Slavery, Museums, and Public Engagement. And I was like, what does that really mean, right? What is slavery? Museums have started, they've been around, at least in the United States, for, the last part of the 19th century. We have one of the oldest museums in the country here, just a few meters away, the Carnegie Museum of Art. And I started my own museum. It's small, it's intimate. I hope you come visit sometime. And then public engagement, what we're doing right now. On a smaller level, but then globally, what does public engagement really mean to us? And that with our smartphones and our digital devices, we are all connected. Whether we're working in silos or playing a video game, it's so important for us to know that what you do it ripples out, it has consequences, it makes an impact, and I just want to also offer that up before I get into what I'm going to talk about. All right, thank you. So it was so wonderful to see this actual slide, because when you go to the actual exhibition, there's so many people. It's hard to even look at some of the material. And so I'm looking forward to going back, maybe on a day that it's not open to the public, which I usually do. When you have good friends on the inside, you get to go into the museum when there's not a lot of people that will impede your overall experience of that. All right, next slide, please. So, Stephen Towns' Declaration of Resistance. Yes, that's me, and that's Stephen Towns, an artist that I've had the pleasure of working with for a while. Stephen is originally from South Carolina. He's based in Baltimore, and some people might be familiar with him regionally, but also at the Blacksonian. He is in the collection there. And so I wanted to kind of draw these parallels between In Slavery's Wake and this exhibition that I organized through the work of Stephen's, called Stephen Towns' Declaration of Resistance. And it opened 3 years ago at the Westmoreland Museum of American Art, and then it traveled to 2 other museums. And we worked together for over a good 2.5, 3 years in trying to kind of think through the different themes about how Black labor in all of its manifestations have really impacted the United States, first and foremost, because we are both American citizens. But we also thought about how the work of Black labor in the United States has also has a farther reach globally, right? Because the economics, our social mobility, whether we were forced to come here, whether we voluntarily came here, all of that is wrapped into the economics and the social impact of slavery. But we also wanted to not only talk about the oppression and the pain, but also the interiority of enslaved people, free people, and the joy. And so, because we all experience a wide range of emotions, right, throughout our lifetime. And so what you see here is some of the images, the paintings and quilts that Stephen created, all for this show except for one that was his first quilt. And I must say to you about Stephen Towns is he's formally trained as a painter, but he is self-taught as a quilter. And he's been quilting for a decade now, and he has come an extremely long way. It's incredible. So I'm going to show you his first quilt, which, if you go to the next slide, Birth of a Nation. This was the only existing work that I said, Stephen, there is no Declaration of Resistance without Birth of a Nation. And so I said, we have to borrow this quilt from an artist by the name of Mark Bradford, who owns this work now. And Mark Bradford said, absolutely yes. And so here is this hand-stitched quilt that Stephen made of a black woman nursing a white child. All right? And if anybody has ever seen images of this, some people are like, why is there a black wet nurse with a baby? That was very, very prevalent throughout slavery. Enslaved women who had children weren't allowed to, nurse their own children. They were nursing the planters' children and other people. So that's just a reality. But Stephen wanted to really foreground the story of the caretaker, the woman who is literally nursing, feeding a nation. And that's the thing that a lot of black women still do to this day. Not as a wet nurse, but the way in which our contributions tend to be overshadowed, but we do so much. And, excuse me? Figuratively, yes, exactly. Yes, absolutely. And so Stephen uses a lot of abstraction and figuration, kind of weaving that into a lot of his work. And so you'll see, that's all right, that Stephen has this wet nurse. The background is the flag, if anybody knows the origins of the flag. Betsy Ross did not make the first flag, y'all. That was that's not true. She was one of the flag makers. But this is kind of like the origins of our American flag. And Stephen is suspended this flag right over a mound of dirt because there was a lot of laws and regulations around how one could present a flag. You can't desecrate the flag, and so nowadays people are using the flag for a lot of different forms of resistance, right? People are burning flags. Flags represent a lot of different things. There's coats of armor that are flags, that are banners. People tell stories through banners. Banners and flags were ways of communicating, especially during slavery times, of how enslaved people and free black people would communicate with each other and other abolitionists. All right. This quilt that Stephen made is called Marcus Garvey. Has anybody heard of Marcus Garvey? I know as a child, I grew up in a very pro-black family household. I was raised Catholic, so I went to Catholic school from first grade through 12th. And we could not say Marcus Garvey or Malcolm X in my school because they were all deemed as deviants and bad people. We could talk about Malcolm X, or we could talk about Martin Luther King Jr., yes, but definitely not Malcolm X or Marcus Garvey. So Stephen wanted to really, you'll see in this image, I don't know if everybody can see what's going on here. Can anybody describe what's going on here? I don't want to be doing all the talking here. I want to kind of engage y'all, if you have me. Can you see what's going on here? There's a guy. Okay, go ahead. Yes.
Are too. Is there like making a flag and there's like a boat in the background? Like, are they getting transported?
Yeah. So there's a group of people in the foreground making this flag, and the person with this kind of French getup, because Marcus Garvey was enamored with Napoleon. Actually, if you didn't know that, this is a really interesting fact about him. And Marcus Garvey was married twice. Both of his wives were named Amy. And so this one female figure that's to his right is a stand-in for both of the Amys, who were very instrumental in the newspaper and the Black Star line. That's the actual ship you see in the background. And the women around him, right? The women are in this kind of circle with Marcus Garvey. And so has anybody heard of the Pan-African flag? Yes? So they are making the Pan-African flag. All right? Marcus Garvey has been attributed to being the first person. But there were a lot of different people that were using the red, the green, and the black to create this global African flag. And so Stephen and I, in talking about this work and seeing the evolution of Stephen's sketches, he first was thinking about a painting of Marcus Garvey, but then he was like, you know what, I do want to make a quilt of Marcus Garvey. But the women that were central to his work, and he was the man that, there's a lot of stuff going on with Marcus Garvey. Very layered, complicated person, but the work that he was doing was very much about liberating black people globally, and also the whole thing with Liberia too, but I don't want to digress into that. That's a whole other story, which is very fascinating. All right, yes. So this flag, have you all seen this flag? I know you've seen this flag. Can somebody tell me what this flag is? Anybody? You're familiar with this flag, right? Yes.
Familiar, but I'm looking at the number of stars, and I'm thinking those align with the number of countries on the continent, because it looks like a whole lot of stars. And the red, the black, and the green being the primary colors of Africanism, the African diaspora. Black for the people, red for the bloodshed, and green for the fertility of the continent as a whole.
Absolutely.
That's all I got.
That's great. Well, you know that. Okay, thank you. You know that this is the American flag.
Oh, okay.
It's the African American flag. And so it represents, the stars are the 50 states. So it's interesting when you look at something that's like, I was going to put the American flag next to this, but I was like, no, I want to center, David Hammond. So this is the work by David Hammond. And he made this African American flag in 1990. All right, next one, please. So, flags of freedom. Johanna, you were just talking about Nugent Smith. I know Nugent Smith. He's going to be coming to our residency in the fall. So he'll be here in Pittsburgh for 3 months. And Nugent was telling me about his work. And I was just like, oh, we definitely have to. When I went up, I spent a lot of time. I love the interactive nature of like showing him making this work with his uncle, who's a blacksmith. And I think about the ties to the blacksmiths of West Africa. There's just so much layers in here, and I love this, and I hope y'all acquire this work. All right, next one, please. All right, so this is the publication to this exhibition that I wrote. They're all out, or, these were limited edition. And so I just wanted to bring this just in case anybody wanted to go through this. But it takes you through all of Stephen's work from that exhibition and all of the archival material and a timeline. Just like the timeline I really, really appreciated about the abolitionists over, I forget how many centuries. So next slide. In talking about black labor, we also talked about kind of 20th century labor. I never saw a black coal miner until I worked with Stephen on this show. And we went through a lot of different archives. And we looked at archives in West Virginia because most black coal miners resided in West Virginia. And Stephen took this black and white image and then made these mixed media paintings you see based off that image. Next slide, please. Own a Judge. Has anybody heard of Own a Judge? And this whole kind of section talks about resistance, many forms of resistance. Has anybody heard of George and Martha Washington? Yes. Well, Own Judge was an enslaved woman by the Washingtons, and she was actually Martha Washington's personal servant. She was a seamstress. So this is a picture. This is a quilt of Own Judge fleeing in the middle of the night. And all of those silhouettes are people who helped usher her into freedom. All right, next slide. And so we were talking about, anti-slavery revolutions. I love how this whole interactive map, this is all from In Slavery's Wake. I loved how you all showed the different revolts, rebellions at sea, the networks, the publications and all that stuff globally. I really enjoyed that. I would love a copy of that little interaction. So next slide, please. Cultural return. I've been following this man and all of the rebellious things he's been doing, literally going to museums and taking artifacts out, because I did not know until about 5 years ago that 90% of African objects, cultural heritage from the continent, reside outside of the continent. I did not know that percentage. That's a staggering amount. Next slide, please. And then this is my mini museum called Alma Lewis, and we're about honoring the past and cultivating the future. And these are some of the artists that have come through my art space. And the name of Alma Lewis comes from two artists by the name of Alma Thomas and Norman Lewis. So I put their names together. I won't go into details about them. You can Google, learn more about Alma Thomas and Norman Lewis. But right now in our gallery, we have a celebration of our first 3 years of our artist residency. So we have 10 artists. It's called 10 All-Stars, a constellation of 10 resident artists. And so those at the top are 9 of the 10 artists, and they come from anywhere as far as Nigeria and Ghana and Cuba to regional artists here. This is my art space, my art gallery. All right, next slide. This is Yao Owusu, who's from Ghana. He was one of our resident artists, and he is formerly trained as a painter and chemist. And this is one of his sculptural paintings in our show. And he uses pennies and pesewas. And he exposes it to different solvents, and it changes colors. And so he doesn't use any paints to create these abstracted works. All right, I'm almost finished. And we also have the Black Archive. Right now we have over 1,000 books, journals, artifacts. It's all non-circulating at this point in time, all centering the Black experience. And I created the Black Archive based on the education that I did not get in school formally. So I started collecting things, people started giving me things, and things that I could not find in the libraries of the schools that I went to. And so if you come to Alma Lewis, you can experience the Black Archive. That's me talking to some people. I think Lynn, who's here, she's like a part of hers on the side there. But I have a wide range of books, artifacts, journals, oral histories that talk about the Black experience. All right. And then this one I wanted to leave you all with. This is Stephen Towns's work called An Offering. That's at the Blacksonian. It's in the visual arts section. And these banners are in the form of a slave ship. And so this offering is a call, because you talked about the call to action of all of us and how we all can think about what we can do through the work, the individual work that we do, but the collective care that we all share and really creating a more just and equitable future. And then the last slide is of you, that I took a picture of you right before we got on the bus. And so I just want to thank you because I know how much it takes to put together an exhibition. And I only work with early and mid-career artists and living artists. So you all to do all this 10 years is extraordinary. And I'm so glad it's here in the country. So thank you.
Thank you, Kilolo. Jason?
Thank you. My name is Jason Hank. I've been teaching Spanish for the last 23 years in Beaver Area School District. I was asked to be a part of this panel as an educator and I guess the beneficiary of university outreach. So I would like to thank Dr. Keila Grinberg and the Center for Latin American Studies for giving me this opportunity to visit the museum and to speak with you all today. I was so proud to be at the museum with her. And you know, when you're in a museum and you see the little looping documentaries on a screen, and there's a voiceover and there's artifacts and you can hear that person's voice. And I looked to my right and the person that was talking on the screen was standing beside me on Saturday. And I guess that's just always been like, I know her. So there was a moment of pride for me. So why the news of a Pitt faculty member that's a co-curator of an exhibit at a national museum that's going to be traveling internationally hasn't been news that's spread around town is beyond my understanding. So trips to museums and workshops and school visits and movie series, lectures, etc., these all help provide valuable teacher professional development. Programming at class at the University of Pittsburgh helps to bring the world into our classrooms, and it expands our knowledge, giving it more depth. It gives us new perspectives and allows us a chance to network with other educators. This type of professional development offers a variety. The professional development that's offered at our schools, while necessary, isn't really targeted to our areas of focus. And so many schools do have flexible or independent professional development. And so there are teachers that are actively seeking opportunities to engage more with things like that are offered here at the university. So why go to a history museum? I'm sure that's something that the message I have behind this is something that I'm not going to tell this crowd anything that you don't know, but I think it's important to remind ourselves. What's there is curated by experts. It's well thought out. It's carefully made into an experience that's themed, immersive, and multimodal, offering a variety of lenses through which to view what's being presented, whether it be sports or activism, music, art, or even ancestral traditions. I was reminded of during our visit the importance of television, movies, music, and books, and stories of athletes, activists, and politicians helped shape public opinion. Of course, there's Martin Luther King and Muhammad Ali and Shirley Chisholm, and countless others. Do any of you know who Curt Flood was? He lost his Major League Baseball career in the 1970s because he didn't want to get traded from the St. Louis Cardinals to the Philadelphia Phillies. His contract had been fulfilled to the Cardinals, but there was a such thing called the reserve clause in Major League Baseball. And if they didn't want to let you go, they wouldn't allow you. And Mr. Flood argued that's modern-day slavery. He lost his career. He was blackballed in Major League Baseball, and very few people came out to support him. Jackie Robinson did. And he lost his case in the Supreme Court, but because of his unwillingness to cave to the reserve clause, we have free agency to this day in all major league sports. My purpose in pointing out the story of Curt Flood is that there's something for everyone at a museum. Do you like art, music, science, fashion, sports? There was someone from that background who did something pretty bold and important to benefit others. You won't change people's minds with facts, but you will change their minds with appealing to their feelings. A museum exhibit presents facts by appealing to one's humanity. At the In Slavery's Wake exhibit, among other artifacts that were used in the dehumanization of people, was a scale from Brazil that was used to weigh people. As you stand there looking at that, you can't not imagine someone, a human being, being weighed on that, or yourself. Being at a museum offers what social media doesn't offer. It offers a longer, in-depth, evidence-based primary documents that look into history, offering you the time and space to contemplate. It would be a fantastic outreach to any university department to lead trips to museums like the one that we took on Saturday, to monuments, to do geological or ecological tours. Many of the lectures and symposiums I've seen at Pitt over the last 20 plus years are open to students and the public. Opening these types of field trips to targeted groups, for example, local teachers, local officials, parents of Pitt students, or even special donors, may be a great way to foster and deepen relationships in the community. In my trip to the museum on Saturday, forgive me for making this personal for a few moments, but there is an underlying point to it. I walked away with a sense of pride at the small rural school that I attended in the 80s and 90s. I first learned that slavery was a thing when I was in 5th grade in Miss Eaton's class when we were talking about the Underground Railroad. And of course, throughout English classes in my experience, we learned about Martin Luther King and wrote essays and watched parts of Eyes on the Prize. And anytime the Civil Rights era came up in school, there was a clear sense that we had righted a wrong, that we were being on the right side of history, and that we had been taking a real step forward as a society. My 8th and 10th grade history teacher, Mr. Chesko, explained to us in graphic detail the inhumane and humiliating treatment of African slaves. He didn't have a lot of handouts, but one paper I do specifically remember him giving us was a diagram of a slave ship. I saw that very same diagram on Saturday at our visit to the museum. In 10th grade, while we were talking about the rise of fascism in Europe, Mr. Chesko told us about Jesse Owens. He said Hitler wanted the Olympics to be a showcase of Nazi perfection and the superiority of the Aryan race. And Jesse Owens blew their doors off. He said that with such pride. But he also told us that while Mr. Owens was regarded as a hero, he had a hard time finding work and a place to live when he came back to the United States. Mr. Chesko also took time to draw parallels from the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil War era to quotes from George Jefferson and Archie Bunker from television in the 70s. It dawned on me on the way home that many of my teachers were young during the Civil Rights era. They lived through that period, so teaching about the roots of racism likely became even more important to them. Talking to my mom after the trip, who went to the same high school that I did 30 years previously, they didn't have as detailed as an in-depth history lesson on slavery or its impacts or its roots in what would have been then modern-day racism. So what does that mean for today? It concerns me that what my teachers taught me in the 90s would be today labeled as woke. But those atrocities actually happened, and they still have an impact today. There's a fine line that social studies teachers have to walk, social studies in particular have to walk, with teaching history and not being labeled as something awful. Talking to my colleagues at my school, they still teach about slavery in the Reconstruction era in the same way I learned it, and using quotes from people of the era that they very much made it clear that they were fighting to preserve slavery. They even teach about modern-day slavery being rooted in the Reconstruction era. But today, fortunately, they have not been challenged on this or called into question, which I think is a testament to their professionalism, their objective presentation of the facts. As a white man, learning about the injustices of the past, it never made me feel guilty about myself or my family, as some today would suggest that it's doing. It didn't make me hate America or ashamed in general of American history or its founding principles. If anything, it taught me to reject hate. And it reinforced that all institutions created by people are indeed works in progress. Unfortunately, a lot of folks see the end of slavery or the accomplishments of the civil rights era as two major obstacles that were overcome and now everything's okay and everyone enjoys the same civil rights and freedoms. It seems that today that Black Lives Matter isn't regarded in the same way as slogans from the civil rights era had been, and it's used, sadly, to divide us. Subjugation and marginalization is still happening today. We see that it continues from the cobalt mines in Congo or land rights issues, particularly for indigenous people in Latin America. The study or even recognition that there continues to be cultural, environmental, and societal impacts has become a lightning rod issue. It's instantly labeled as CRT or woke without people really understanding what that even means. I'm not sure I understand what that even means. But we are faced today with an Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy who is quoted as saying, "Competent white men must be in charge if you want things to work." That wasn't said in the 1950s. That was said in October of last year. That would have been a normal thing to have said before the Civil Rights era and flatly rejected in the 90s. But something like that has become, it's said by a public official without any recourse. Mark Twain has said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And what about in my classroom? It's hard for me to my involvement in things at the University of Pittsburgh over the last 20 plus years, it's hard for me to parse out specific, linear, this has caused me to do that. So if anything, I'll leave you with it's empathy for my students and their backgrounds, making sure that all students are seen and heard, known, and accepted. It's actually, I'm proud to say that's a sign that our new superintendent has had us hang in our rooms, and I love that he has. I tell my students, if you learn nothing from me, I hope that you've learned how hard it is to learn another language. Imagine doing it as an adult with kids and a job and bills to pay. Don't ever judge a person for the way they talk. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say maybe quick comment and then we can open up. It's so interesting to hear both of your perspectives and the ways that you were able to connect this visit to your own work. And I just want to really thank you for like this deep engagement. I've been taking notes and the ways that, I don't know, the things that you've seen, like I'm just like so interested. I will be looking at the catalog of Stephen Townsend's quilts, and when you were talking about the scale in Brazil, how that impacted you, and there's so much we don't know about that scale, and so there were a lot of conversations on should we include it, should we not, and I think that's a big part of this type of work too, is like leaning into those silences and thinking about them as like invitations rather than obstacles to avoid. And I see that in some of the work that you both talked about, right, is kind of stepping into that void and speaking into it. So just want to say thank you, and yeah, maybe we can open up.
Open for questions, comments.
I'll begin.
If you can introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. I'm Shalai Brimaway. I'm Associate Director in our School of Education here in the University of Pittsburgh and a faculty affiliate for Africana Studies. I think, Kilolo, it was your slide that had the image of the continent and where the slave revolts had taken place.
And that's from the exhibition
Okay.
in Slavery's Wake.
And yes, that is the one. So at this very, very big age I am, I turned 50 on Sunday. I just learned last year in 2024 that there was slavery occurring on the east coast of Africa. I had never heard that. And I don't even remember how I stumbled into that information. But I was like, how is this possible? Right? And I think about the ways in which the education system has failed all of us in this country, right? That slavery was only happening, just in these few places along the East Coast, and all the good white people lived up north and all the bad white people lived down south, right? Well, then how come the good white people up north didn't teach me about like the whole wake of enslavement? And so when I seen that on there, it just recalled that to my memory. And I'm thinking about this idea of cultural return, not in quite the same way as the gentleman from the slide, but I had a chance to go to Ghana and Togo in 2022 because I wanted to go home. I wanted to put my feet in the sand, right, of the places or some place where my ancestors have come from. And in December of this year, I'll be headed to Zanzibar in Tanzania because I want to see and put my feet, like have a baptism on the other side of the continent, right, where my people have come from. And so I just appreciated looking up and seeing that red dot there and knowing that I'm on my way home again, after thinking that I would never actually have an opportunity to go home.
Yeah.
So just wanted to share that with you all.
You know, there's something about that interactive map that showed all of these different rebellions and networks and everything like that. Mutiny at sea. People thought, oh, once we came, I'm just talking about the United States, there was all this resistance. It was happening from the moment we were taken from the continent. And so all of these suppressed or hidden histories, these oral stories that have been shared throughout the centuries. That slide, and I wish I could have showed more of South America on there too, but I only, as it was interacting, I was just trying to take pictures. But still, I was like, okay, I hope the audience gets an idea of the wide impact that people, these networks of people, like we the people, right, were working together. In some places it may have taken centuries, other places like in Haiti. I'll never forget when I learned that the Haitian Revolution, if you think about the map of Haiti or of Hispaniola, Haiti's on one side, the Dominican Republic is on the other side, and how the Haitian Revolution actually happened in Santo Domingo, which is in modern day DR, right? And so we think about space and time is not linear. You know, things shift all the time. And so to think about that island and how colorism is broken down, and if you have more African blood in you, you're lesser, these caste systems, these hierarchies that are really made to try to divide all of us, right? Because whenever we try to coalesce together, there's always a system trying to break us apart to make us lesser, right? Less powerful. And so that's another thing that I took away from this slide of where we are today and how we can never forget, like, we the people can make the change because we are the change. We just have to have the courage to do it. And it happens in so many different networks, so many different ways. You don't have to be out in the street. There's some people that are out in the street. There's some people that write. There are some people that are creating spaces of respite for us, right? Prayer, spirituality, all of that. That takes so many different networks for us to live a liberatory life.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you photographed this and brought this interactive into this space, because you're so right. That's something we talked about, was thinking about when we talk about abolition, and particularly Black abolition, right? Thinking about, you know, the abolitionist movement as a multiracial movement, yes, but also that there were Black abolitionists that were pushing for not only an end to slavery, but a sort of future of equity that went beyond sort of a legal end. That there are so many different ways and practices that abolitionists took, right? It's not just a sort of academic or political movement, but also there was armed resistance, there were publications, there were revolts and rebellions. And this image, to your point, I thought it was really powerful too. I knew the data, right, around slave ship revolts or revolts at sea. There are over 500 that have been recorded. But when we started to pinpoint them on the map, the locations that the revolts were documented as having occurred, you see that they're primarily happening just all along. So on this map, they're in the blue, the western coast of Africa. meaning to your point that resistance is starting from the very beginning. And like, that's such a powerful visual. And then I really appreciated your comments around, this cultural return and this process that you're engaging in, because it makes me think of, there's a story that's not in the exhibition, but it's something we talked about when we were thinking about objects and stories that one of our colleagues in Senegal brought up. He's an archaeologist, Ibrahima Chow, who has done many decades of work at Gorée Island, which was a point of departure for many enslaved people in West Africa. And he, in their possession at Gorée, it's open to the public. People can come, and there's like decades of visitor guest books. And I thought that's so interesting to think about, who are the people who are coming here, right? What are their stories? And just the sort of visualization, materialization of that desire to learn, to reconnect, to kind of stand in the places of our ancestors and their ancestors. So I don't know, that's just, I think, a really, really powerful story of this moment in the wake.
Thank you. We have a question. Yeah.
I'm Brock Baylor. I teach in the Religious Studies department here. I teach a philosophy of race and religion class, and thank you so much for this. I'm struck particularly by this image and a common quip I talk about in my class that slave apologists say, that everybody thought that way, right? Everybody thought that way back then, but no, they didn't. Right? But my question for you is, as you go through the process of creating an exhibit like this and curate it, like, how do you decide what to cut and what to keep in? Like, that had been a really painful process to because when I do this work, I feel like I want to include everything as possible as possible, but then something gets lost in the message if you do that. So how did you work through that?
Well, I can start, and then Keila, I think you should weigh in too. I think, it's a challenging process in many ways, especially with a topic like this. So if we're thinking about the global history of racial slavery, we're thinking about like 4 centuries of history, but then we're trying to make these connections to the present. And so it almost feels like you could tell stories that cross like all space and time. And that's a challenging place to start from. But I found that the more that we like sort of veering into a place where we're trying to be more encyclopedic, like you mentioned, things just started to get lost in that. It starts to feel so incomplete. And so our approach was to kind of create certain vignettes, and knowing that we weren't trying to tell this full story in a linear or sort of progressive way. And so I think like practically that's how we managed that. But, we also had many months of meeting as a curatorial group, different discussions, agreements, disagreements, arguments, and so we weren't always on the same page, and there wasn't always consensus. We had to land somewhere in many cases, but I think that made the project stronger. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
It's just, that's why we're smiling here, right? Because everyone can imagine that this is a complicated process, because it just involves all these curators from different places, thinking that our own stories are more important than the others, right? And then the stories but what I think that what is really interesting is that when you start seeing that the actual story that, let's say it's based in Brazil, it's sort of like not only connected to something that happened in South Africa, but it's also a story that is not only connected to Brazil. So just thinking beyond the original areas, which is something we're not used to. So it's really transformative and it's interesting. So it's good. We're not used. We are, as professors, students, we're used to do our own work, and then we engage, right? If we engage. And when if just seeing this as a truly collective work, it's a big learning experience, right? Because then it goes, and then who knows what's going to happen when this exhibit lands in Rio? Just maybe we'll see some different content.
Yeah.
Interesting. We have Paula and then
Steve.
Yeah, okay.
Hi, my name is Paula Cooper. I teach in History of Art and Architecture. Currently teaching a class called The Viral Image, and we're talking about many things and many memes, but also about the way that Black abolitionists and civil rights leaders use photography and visual media with a viral intent for their campaigns. So I'm very excited to see this aspect of the exhibition. I was curious, given the starting venue of the National Museum for African American History and Culture, the museum only opened in 2016 to the public. This project is 10 years long, or rich, or many. So I was wondering how you worked to start out in a museum that was still just in its infancy, maybe. I know the project started earlier when it was approved by Congress, but how you were balancing the scope of the exhibition with the broader context of the museum, and I suppose that's multiplied once you think of 6 international venues. But for the purposes of containment, how that worked with your starting venue.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can answer it in some ways. In other ways, I'm probably not the best person because I came onto the project about 4 years ago. So it had already been a lot of conversations leading up to that. And also I wasn't here and the sort of inception of the museum. But I think what I can say is that this project in many ways grew quite organically, and it grew sort of from the outside of the museum in rather than the opposite direction. So in 2014, the co-director, Professor Tony Bogues, brought a group of curators and museum professionals and scholars who are interested in doing work around the histories of slavery and their afterlives to a conference at Brown University. As the other project director, Paul Gardulo, puts it, he feels like it was not a trick, but with this, like, a sort of ruse to kind of get people together to think about, could we create an exhibition together? And so that's where the process began, and then from there, and Keila, you can talk more about it, it's been, I think, quite an organic journey where some members have left, some members have come on, the group has grown in interesting ways. But I think in earnest, maybe around 2018, once it was decided that this is the goal, the output would be a traveling exhibition, then things, moved a little bit more into like that museum, project management, production space, which is interesting, and became really driven through the lens of our museum. And that means that the project kind of went from being kind of brainchild of this collaborative group of curators to now having to bring in museum staff from our designers. So it was designed by a team of in-house designers to our registrars, our collection management staff, our project management team. And as you can imagine, the museum has its own, particular ways of doing things and some real limitations, boundaries, and restrictions just being as a part of the federal government. So it was an interesting negotiation to help our internal staff kind of understand the uniqueness of a project like this and what we were trying to do. As I think I mentioned, this is a first for our museum in many ways. So that was a little painful at times to say, yes, it is challenging to move cowrie shells out of Brazil into the U.S., and we do have to go through the U.S. Fisheries and Wildlife Services, and it would be easier if we didn't, but we need to because it's important to the story, right? And I think those negotiations went both ways, right? For our collaborators also, helping them understand sort of the limitations of our staff too. So it was quite interesting. And then, as you mentioned, as the exhibition travels, it's going to reach a whole new set of staff. And so teams from the different museums that it's going to were included in the process, but as it moves, those teams will grow. And so we're sort of in the infancy of that part of it too, right? We have a meeting after this with colleagues from Brazil, and will, as the museum, then be in a space as more of a consultant and collaborator, but really the local teams will then be driving how the exhibition is brought in and activated. And so it's an interesting exchange that we're figuring out.
I just wanted to add that, it's true, we're still figuring out, and of course, the museum in Rio also has its own limitations and, lots of changes. I was part of the Brazil team in 10 years ago. Now I'm here, so it's
Yeah.
but I wanted to say two things. One is that this was really, I think, an important moment for us that we were at this conference in 14, not only because that was sort of like a dream, right? Let's put an exhibit together, but it was also a very, very seminal discussion on public history and how what we, and I as a traditional historian of the archives, but many of us there, were really thinking about ways in which we needed to get out of our small spaces and reach out to the public. And then the other thing that I think is interesting is that as the museum opened, if you have been to the Blacksonian, you'll see that there is an international part in the beginning. There is very small, that leads to the African American experience, which is, US-based African American experience, which is something that is understandable given what this museum is for. But for many of us who are not, who are wishing to see more of those global stories, was kind of hard because people would, there's even a map of the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, that all points to the US. And it's like, as we know, the US received 5% of the enslaved Africans, and 95 went to Latin America, going to the Atlantic region. So I think as soon as the museum opened, there was this call for making this a more global exhibit. So that's why actually lots of us have been sort of claiming for, as after the exhibit goes everywhere, if it can be incorporated into the actual exhibit would be wonderful, but that, we don't know. So there is, you first. Yeah, then Steve. Sorry, let me go with her and then Steve. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, okay. That's fine. Then Steve and then you. Let me, organize it.
Hi, I'm Molarski. I work here at USIS. In particular, I work a lot with K-12 educators. And my question sort of has both the educator and the curator hat on, so it's so everyone can feel the answer. But first, for the curators or people who've done that, obviously when designing an exhibit, you've got a lot of audiences you're looking to sort of reach. And my question was specifically, when you're conceptualizing that, do you consciously think about educators who might be coming to this space and using it as a teaching tool, or is it something that you sort of develop later on the back end as you're already sort of through the process? And then for the educators, how do you think about using an exhibit like this or working in that? Is it something that you're thinking, I can use this, especially when many students who aren't local can't come to it, and how you think about using this as a tool?
Did you want to add the curator first? I don't know the order in which you asked that, but let's go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
It's a difficult question to answer. Did I experience something on Saturday that I'm definitely going to include in my curriculum? No. Directly, is there a direct line? No. How do I bring that to my students? I guess that's a question I still need to ponder. Does your question have? Do you mean in general, or my visit on Saturday, or?
In general, or even any kind of exhibit, if you're thinking about working with an exhibit like this, maybe, because I know part of it's written in Spanish, and so thinking about, is there any, ways in which, especially, you might be able to take an exhibit like this and bring it into the classroom, even in the smallest of ways. And I know it's still fresh. I mean, it's, from Saturdays, it's a lot to develop a whole curriculum in a couple days, so it's okay.
I don't have an intelligent answer to your question. I'm sorry. I don't have. It's not something that other than encouraging them to visit museums, and when I said about why we should visit museums, I actually do plan on sharing with my students, and that was more of the audience that I had in mind. I joked at the beginning of it, like, this is likely not a crowd I need to convince of why they should go to museums, right? So that was the audience that I did have in mind for that. But I wish I had a better answer for you.
I would like to hear your perspective as well. But yeah, from the curatorial side, particularly, I think on all exhibitions in our museum, but definitely on this one I can speak to. Our content team had, curators, researchers, and also educators. In fact, one of the key members of our content team is an educator at the museum named Kendra Flanagan. And so I think having her perspective from the early stages of exhibition development was just so not only beneficial, but like crucial, honestly. I think it's the way it should be done. I think in some museum spaces, people can bring educators in sort of after or to like kind of react. But really we should be building things together because, they're, especially with a show like this, there are many different audiences that will meet it in some way or one way or another. And yeah, we're, spend a lot of time thinking about getting the show open, but now we're in a space, we were just talking about it last night at dinner, to think about, what educational materials could come from a show like this, how we can engage educators across geographies. I think it would be really interesting when thinking about like curriculum or sort of like learning plans and lessons to bring educators from each of the spaces that the exhibition is traveling to in conversation with one another, to think about, where there might be some synergies and speak with each other. And then as a big part of this project, we're also thinking about how do we get beyond the walls. Only a certain amount of people will come to the museum and into the other museums as it travels, but there's a real potential for the digital. And so the MOC has a really wonderful digital exhibition platform called the Searchable Museum. And so we created a searchable museum exhibition for In Slavery's Wake. Unfortunately, it's solely in English. That's another negotiation we had to make, but I think that could be a great platform for educators and for anyone who hasn't been able to go physically to the space. A lot of the content is there, the videos, the artists. So yeah, but yeah, I'd like to hear from you too.
Yeah, some of my former experiences are working in museums, and I saw how siloed they are structured. And so you have curatorial, you have marketing, and you have education. And for me, I never worked like that. My brain works like, okay, the more people that have different skill sets and experiences, the better we're going to be. And so this show, Declaration of Resistance, Stephen Towns' Declaration of Resistance, this was an independent curatorial work, so I had more agency. And so working with these 3 different museums, I actually talked to the education departments beforehand. In the case with Westmoreland Museum, where it originated, I did talk to them well before that, but I also talked to other educators that were much more familiar with the historical information that Stephen and I were looking at and wanting to then widen, expand, but then also knowing that our audience was going to be grade 7 and up. And so another thing that I did curatorially is every show that I curate, I always use books and other material as another entry point for visitors to experience and learn about the artists, the curator, the different time periods. So for example, with Stephen's show, he was working with quilts, he was working with mixed media. And so we actually took some of that material so people could literally touch, but then also certain fabrics that you couldn't really let the visitors touch was behind like a vitrine. But also, I think the importance of having a publication, and I love it that you all have a publication. You can actually have a digital version of that, and also having different talks online that people that can't physically be there, they can still experience it in some capacity. So I really think it's important for us, I feel like, as curators, to know that we aren't the just smartest person in the room. There are so many other voices and perspectives that will make the exhibition stronger. And so if we can get over ourselves, I think you'll then have a strong show like In Slavery's Wake. So, yeah.
So I'm Johnson. I'm a history major here at Pitt, among other things. And first, I wanted to second some of the things others have said about the map. We had a visitor to the history department last week that was developing a map of resistance to slavery, the National Park Service, and just I'm from the Northwest, and seeing like a dot in the Northwest, I'm like, what's that? I didn't think we had that in the Northwest. And so, I mean, this map doesn't have that one, but
Okay.
so just kind of having a connection there is, I think, really important. And then I had two questions about kind of the creating the exhibit. First, the choice to have Spanish. I was wondering if it was more of like an access thing, or also kind of trying to connect the story of American enslavement with like the Spanish-speaking world. Because I know for me, the kind of nodes of enslavement were like southern U.S., the Caribbean, and Brazil. And then it was only in high school where my teacher was like, hey, so there's this place called Veracruz in Mexico. And then my other question was about just kind of the images of the exhibit and the name, like the wake, and a lot of like, I know there's a lot of like water and blue, and I was wondering about some of the choices behind that.
Yeah, those are great questions. For the language, yeah, and you can probably speak to this too. We had a lot of conversations with the curatorial team around just around language in general. Would this be a monolingual exhibition? I think we kind of surveyed everyone, 2 languages, 1 language, 3 language, and most of the curatorial group was interested in a bilingual exhibition. And so then within their, our own sort of regional teams, then we had to have conversations around, okay, what should those 2 languages be? And so for us at Namak, we had to, we kind of had different, there are different things that kind of led us to Spanish. It makes a lot of sense in so many ways, right? Like you're saying, connecting to the history. I mean, that's one thing that we're really conscious of, that in this mapping interactive, I'm so happy you have a picture of this. It's so helpful. But that was one thing we thought about with the topic of Black abolition, for example. The historiography can be so focused on like the Anglo world and sort of British North America, and we needed to do some work to think about abolition as a global practice, right? As a practice that is not just included in Latin America, but as a space where there were so many people fighting for the end of slavery. And so there's that connection there. And then also just for our audiences, there's so many Spanish-speaking audiences in Washington, D.C., and at the Smithsonian, there's kind of been a precedent in some other museums to start doing bilingual exhibitions regularly. So in the American History Museum, for example, I think all of their exhibitions moving forward since just a few years ago are now bilingual in Spanish and English. And so that made sense for us too. And then your other question was about, remind me.
Water motifs.
Oh, the water motifs. Yeah. So the metaphor of the wake, and then the sort of motifs of water throughout. Yeah, so the curatorial team, this was, again, before my time, but it was definitely inspired deeply by the work of the theorist and scholar Christina Sharp and her metaphor of the wake of anti-Blackness. And so the team thought about that as a really productive metaphor for thinking about how to approach a history like this from a global perspective. How to approach a history like this across time. And then in this group, adding that global perspective kind of into that metaphor. But if you think about a wake, quite literally, it's like waves coming off of a ship. And so water is one of the things that ties all of these locations together. It's so central in this history for many reasons. And so, for the designers really picked up on that motif of the wake, of reverberations, ripple effects, how water can transport both people and ideas, help us move across space. So really water as a vehicle. And a lot of times when you think about when water is sort of thought about in relationship to this history, we think about water as a site of violence and death, which it was. But there are so many stories around how people used water as a vehicle for mobility and to secure freedom for themselves, whether that be physically or spiritually. And so that's something that we want to elevate in the piece and in the exhibition.
I would just want to add, little thing is that, first, it is interesting that this is, when we think about collaboration, it's really, I don't know that everyone that visits the exhibit here will really think that we feel that the Smithsonian is also learning something with that experience, right? And of course, it's obvious. So there's no exhibit like this that will be just one language outside the US, right? And then when the question came to us, the discussion was how many languages? We were 3, we were 4. And of course, this is always a negotiation between what people want and what is possible. So right now, I'm working in just reading the translation into Portuguese. And in your question, one thing that is really it's complicated is that the word wake doesn't translate into Portuguese at all. That we are changing the whole title because wake, if you translate the word, does not make sense in the way that, wake is such a wonderful word in English for that. It's perfect. We don't have a similar word in Portuguese and in Spanish either, I think. So that doesn't work well. And that was a discussion that we had. And it's like, how do we do that? So there's a lot of coming and going in this. In this negotiation process is also a negotiation process within how important is translation and how we do this work that is it is really, really complicated. Right. Yeah. Alejandra?
I have a question. Hi, my name is Educator. Excuse me, I'm a PhD history student. Keila's my professor. Thank you so much, everyone, for your presentation. And maybe this is not the best way to end. I'm just curious to know what kind of backlash any of you, all of you, are experiencing, especially because the museum is affiliated with the government. And we do know that education is sort of experiencing a lot of silencing in this regard as well. So I'm just curious if you can speak to anything that's already happened, if there's anything that you're anticipating that might happen in terms of silencing this kind of work.
Yeah, I can start if you want. That's such an important question. It's a big question. It's definitely something top of mind, just being in, everything that's happening. But for us, thus far, we haven't received much explicit backlash. Not to say that can't come or it won't come. And it's an interesting question to think about in the U.S., but also as it travels, and as each place has their own context, and there's this sort of rising, tide, whatever you might want to call it. But I think I take a lot of heart in the message that we're receiving from our leadership at the Smithsonian, and particularly the director of our museum, and thinking about this museum in particular as being a museum that has really gone through quite a lot. I mean, we've opened just 10 years, but this is a museum that is 100 years in the making. So there are generations of Black Americans, African American people who advocated for this museum across time. And so really I see this, we're in a moment in time. It's 100 years in the making, and I think it will be here 100 more years. And this exhibition is, it's a moment in time. But it is timely. I mean, that the visitor response questions I think I showed at the end of my slides, our educator Kendra I mean, we've received thousands, which is really amazing thus far. And she's gone through and started to process. And, you know, as of January, the tone of those questions have changed, right? And people are really reacting to the current administration and these executive orders. That's also interesting. So I see there's need for people to express what they're going through, and then kind of we're recording that in this moment too. So, you know, we just kind of continue to do the work, and that's a big thing I take from the history, is just thinking about the things and the systems that people have navigated before us, and it's like we just got to keep going. Yeah, but interested to hear y'all's thoughts on that question.
Saying that it's in the front of mind is accurate. Yeah, it's a hell of a way to end the discussion. I'm proud to say that my administration at my school approved my being here today as a school business day, and that my participation on Saturday was part of my professional development. And so that was refreshing and reassuring. I just have to keep going on, like, you know, the way I talk, I would be proud for anybody to come into my classroom on any given day at any given time, and whatever is happening in my classroom, I would be proud to present without any sort of defense or concern. And so that was my attitude in what I prepared, what I said today too.
Yeah. Well, I'm a Black woman, so I should have been banned a long time ago. So I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. Yes, funders have said they've shifted some funders have said they've shifted, redirected their, you know, what they've been supporting in the past. Yes, I've seen that tide kind of change. There were some things that, talking about revolution and resistance, for Stephen's show, we actually had books that were on the banned list in the exhibition. And ironically, all of the presenting venues, a lot of them didn't know, or if they saw it, they didn't say anything. And so even in Boise, Idaho, where I thought was going to be an uphill battle, people received the show, like had record-breaking attendance at every exhibition. And these are like white people. I'll never forget, at Westmoreland Museum, this white man came up to me and I was like, uh-oh. And I was like, okay, let's just keep a poker face. Let's just hear what he has to say. I thought he was going to come up and say, this is wrong, or whatever. I thought he was just going to come in with some vitriol. And he says, we might not see eye to eye, because he said he was a Republican. And I was like, well, how do you know what I am? But anyway, he did start by saying he was a Republican. And he said that I never knew this information, I was never taught this information, and I'm glad that this show exists. This is what this white man said to me. And I just said, thank you. Yeah. So this is ending on an upbeat note. You know, never judge a book by its cover kind of thing. But sometimes you got to trust your instincts too, because there can be some harm there too. But usually I feel like this is an opportunity for us to challenge our own ways of thinking, right? And expand, right? Because history is not flat. It's not linear. There's so much more, and it makes us better people. The more we know, the more empowered and better agency we have. No matter how hard, how liberating it is, it just makes us better human beings. Yeah.
I just want to add, that wasn't my intention to be a Debbie Downer.
No.
But thank you all for creating space, or spaces where you're telling stories about resistance and rebellion and rich stories. That you're creating a space where people can continue to do that, and I think that's wonderful. So great.
So with that note, I want to say a couple of things. First, you're all invited for the other follow-up of this series, which is on April 2nd. We're going to receive Professor Marta Abreu from Rio, who is leading a international group that is doing archaeological research on a slave shipwreck in the south of Rio. So she'll be here, she'll talk to our class, and then she will give a talk, I believe, here in this room. Second, I hope to see you all in Rio in November, when we'll be hosting and opening an exhibit and an international conference as well. And finally, I hope that all of you that have not been yet to the exhibit, now leave here just thinking about planning your trip to DC. It's really wonderful to think about, your last question, Alejandra. It's, we live in the slavery's wake, right? We live that. It's nowadays. And if there is an important time for this exhibit to be on, it's now. So it's really now. And the second thing is that freedom, the In Slavery's Wake is the title, but the subtitle is Making Black Freedom in the World. And freedom is a collective word, right? There's no such a thing as individual freedom or seeking for individual freedom. So as you go to the exhibit, we'll remember that the title in Slavery's Wake, where we're living, but what I think collectively, what we're really, really seeking is freedom for all of us. So thank you very much. Please join me. Thank you for this.